The fog is lifting. Clarity is calling you forward. Welcome to Forward in Freedom. I'm Tanya Johnson. This is where awareness becomes power. Let's move forward in freedom.
Why does choosing peace sometimes feel like you're doing something wrong? Hello, friend. I am Tanya J, your host for Forward in Freedom, the podcast for people navigating complex dynamics who are ready to think clearly, trust themselves again, and move forward with confidence. You are invited into the journey from fog to freedom. In the last episode, we talked about how clarity changes relationships, how not everyone can come with you into your next season. And today we're finishing that thought because one of the first emotions that rises when you outgrow a relationship isn't relief, it's guilt. Guilt loves moments of transition. It shows up when you stop rescuing, respond slower, hold your boundaries, stop absorbing chaos, tell the truth, choose rest. Not because those choices are wrong, but because they interrupt patterns. Most guilt doesn't come from conscious, it comes from breaking silent contracts. I'll carry this. I'll stay flexible. I won't push back. I'll make it work no matter what. I'll protect everyone else at my own expense. And when those agreements expire, guilt rushes in to enforce the old order. Guilt often appears when an old agreement expires. What does guilt versus conviction look like? Conviction clarifies, guilt clouds. Conviction steadies, guilt agitates. Conviction draws you forward. Guilt tries to drag you backward. And some people assume discomfort always means wrongdoing. But sometimes discomfort simply means you are no longer willing to participate in distortion. Not every uncomfortable feeling is warning. Not every uncomfortable feeling is a warning. Some are growing pains. Now, here's where this becomes more than internal. Because guilt doesn't rise in a vacuum, it usually shows up inside relationships, especially relationships that depended on the version of you that is now changing. Which brings us to something many people don't want to name. Why outgrowing people is inevitable in high conflict dynamics. Let's say this plainly. In relationships marked by volatility, control, emotional instability, or chronic blame, growth becomes threatening. When one person heals, the imbalance becomes visible. When one person slows down, the chaos is exposed. When one person requires respect, the old system cracks. High conflict dynamics survive through overfunctioning, appeasing, silence, emotional labor, shrinking. So when you stop shrinking, the relationship doesn't simply feel different, it becomes structurally unsustainable. not because you become superior, but because the arrangement depended on your exhaustion. This isn't about personality clashes, it's about viability. A dynamic built on imbalance cannot survive mutual clarity. Some relationships don't end because love disappeared. They end because distortion can't survive awareness. I want to speak gently from my own life. There were times when guilt followed me, not because I was doing something wrong, but because I finally was doing something right. I felt it when I slowed down, when I stopped trying to rescue situations that I didn't create, when I refused to keep participating in patterns that were draining me. And here is what I learned the long way: guilt isn't always conviction. Sometimes it's the grief of leaving a toxic dynamic behind. Sometimes it's the sorrow of realizing when someone never intended to grow with you. Sometimes it's the ache of releasing a version of love that kept hurting you. There were people in my life who did not want to change, and staying connected to them was only pulling me backward. Choosing myself didn't feel triumphant at first. It felt heavy. But what I discovered later was this: what looked like grief in the moment was actually freedom beginning. I also learned something that changed how I think about hope. Hoping someone will change while they continue harming you is hope on a hook. And real hope is never on a hook. Real hope doesn't require you to keep bleeding. Real hope does not ask you to keep shrinking. Real hope makes room for life, for peace, for healing. Sometimes guilt isn't conviction, it's the ache of choosing freedom. And when you begin to realize that a dynamic itself is no longer viable, another layer of guilt often appears: a moral layer, a spiritual sounding layer, one that whispers, if you were more patient, if you were stronger, if you were more forgiving. Let's talk about why that voice is so persuasive. Guilt is persuasive because it borrows sacred language: loyalty, commitment, patience, mercy, forgiveness. But loyalty that requires self erasure is not loyalty. Compassion that costs your safety is not maturity. Endurance without wisdom is not virtue. Self respect is not selfish, it's stewardship. So if guilt isn't always a compass, if growth disrupts unstable systems, and if endurance is not the same as wisdom, then the real work becomes this: Learning how to recognize what season you are actually in and what that season is requiring from you now. Releasing that, releasing responsibility that isn't yours is found in our freedom nugget for the week. Notice what guilt is asking you to carry. Is it asking you to manage someone's emotions, prevent their anger? Is it asking you to stay silent so the peace is artificial? Is it asking you to keep absorbing what should be shared? Write this down. I am responsible for my actions, not for sustaining a system that harms me. Guilt weakens when responsibility is correctly assigned. You are not required to keep breaking yourself to keep something intact. And if this conversation stirs something tender, if it names something that you've been carrying quietly, if part of you recognized yourself in these patterns, I want to slow us down before we end. Because clarity doesn't rush, it settles. You are allowed to grow. You are allowed to mature. You are allowed to require safety. You are allowed to choose a different pattern. Growth doesn't announce itself, it simply keeps choosing clarity, one boundary at a time. Next episode, we're talking about something subtle but exhausting. What happens when you keep explaining yourself to people who have no intention of understanding? Why over explaining drains you? Why you start auditioning for peace? And how to stop negotiating for basic respect. I cannot wait to share that conversation with you. It's going to be awesome. If today's episode names something that you've been carrying, let that sit with you. Follow the podcast so these conversations meet you each week. And if someone crossed your mind while listening, share the episode with them. For additional resources, visit our Clear Direction Coaching website. And I also recommend my book, A Woman's Exodus, Only by Grace. Remember, freedom often begins with the right words at the right time. I am grateful that you showed up for yourself today. This is Tanya J, your host for Forward in Freedom, where we move from fog to freedom. And this is the work of walking free. Until next time, walk forward with clarity.